Hello, everybody. Welcome to the remote Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, or at least an NYU server. I hope you found us here on Twitter or YouTube. It's not really being face-to-face, which is what we love to do at the Institute for Public Knowledge, but it's what we have for now. And there are some advantages. For instance, I know that there are people here from all over the world tonight, and it's great to be with you. Um, I guess I'd have to say that this evening's conversation it turns out to be far more relevant than I would like it to be. Uh, we like to be topical, but this is not the kind of topical we want. I wish we were all together at a more tranquil time where there was a little bit more security and justice and ease in the world. But if you're like me, you're probably not feeling any of those things right now. In fact, what you're probably feeling is that we're in the moment of real crisis, and there's incredible stakes. Uh, we had an election here in the United States. Probably some of you watching are aware that there was just an election, but surely you're also aware that it has not been officially decided, nor has the result been acknowledged by the losing side. And that means we are in fairly dangerous ground. As it happens, the two authors and professors who are here to speak with us tonight have been thinking about power and politics and the way they play out through sex and gender in the kind of formal sphere of political life and in the everyday. We are really in for a terrific conversation tonight. So we have two wonderful speakers, Kate Manne, who's a professor of philosophy at Cornell University and also the author of this very new book entitled, is here, and she's going to speak for about 15 minutes. The subtitle for the book is How Male Privilege Hurts Women. It came out from Crown just a few months ago. And we've asked Kate to speak first for about 15 minutes. And then we're really lucky to have my NYU colleague and friend, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. And Ruth, who's a professor of comparative literature, has written an extraordinary work of comparative history called Strongmen, from Mussolini to the present. And the reason I can't lift up the book for you is because it's not out yet. Actually, the book comes out tomorrow morning. So we wanted to help Ruth launch this book, and we actually got on her calendar the night before the official opening. So you're not going to find it in a physical bookstore until tomorrow morning. And I urge everyone to go out and try to find these books. Ruth's book is terrifyingly prescient, unfortunately. Here we find ourselves at this moment where, today the sitting president of the United States refused to accept the illegitimacy of the election we just had, uh, falsely declared himself the winner of that election, got his party to stand with him in denying the reality of the electoral loss, and then fired the defense secretary, and is now kind of whipping up rumors that next he will fire the head of the FBI, all the while using all the power at his disposal to legally challenge the validity of the elections. And I think for most of us, if we saw this happening in any other state, we would name it for what it is, which is an act of authoritarianism, an act of a strongman. And here it seems bizarre, and it's hard to tell whether we should have a kind of paranoid response to it or reasonable concern about it. It's very difficult for each of us to know how to react. And so we've asked Ruth to help us think about that in the context of several other things that she writes about in this historical book. So the context for tonight is Kate is going to speak for about 15 minutes. Then Ruth will speak for 15 minutes. I'll try to moderate a little bit of a conversation just between the two of them. They've never really met before, and we want them to have a chance to talk about each other's work. And then we're going to open it up for questions, which you will be able to send us on Twitter. And we ask you to go to the Twitter feed to submit the questions, and I'll ask as many of them as we can fit until 6 o'clock. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Kate Manne. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Eric, for the invitation. And I'm just delighted to be in conversation with Ruth about her brilliant and incredibly timely book. So I have just a few slides to share that will give a sense of my basic framework. And hopefully you can all see those slides now. After giving a sense of my basic framework, I want to talk through 3 examples of male entitlement, which I think are perhaps most relevant to Ruth's project. And after that, I'll hand the reins over to her. Okay, so I originally began thinking about male entitlement by thinking about misogyny. And in particular, I was opposed to what I call the naive definition of misogyny, according to which misogyny is primarily a property of individual agents who hate any girl or woman, or at least girls and women generally. And this kind of makes misogyny, this supposedly classic definition of misogyny, makes misogyny something that's highly psychological and is a very individualistic phenomenon. So my alternative definition of misogyny that I hope is more politically and ethically fruitful says that misogyny should rather be defined primarily as a property of social systems or environments as a whole, in as much as girls or women face hostility and hatred that functions to police and enforce patriarchal norms and expectations. So that's a bit of a mouthful, and I can break that down into its component parts. The idea here is that rather than thinking first and foremost of misogynists, we should think first and foremost of misogyny as something that operates within a social environment to keep women and girls under control. And it does that by visiting them with hostility, hatred, other aversive reactions, and behaviors, in as much as, at least paradigmatically, they're violating patriarchal norms and expectations, in as much as they're being quote unquote bad women by the lights of patriarchal values. And I wanted to just quickly show how that's opposed to sexism, as I define it, where I think of sexism rather as an ideology that functions to rationalize and naturalize a patriarchal social order. For example, by positing sex differences that justify a traditional division of labor within the home, or men's dominance over women in areas of traditionally male power and authority, such as many of the ones that Ruth is theorizing in her book. So one way of looking at it is that sexism wears a lab coat. Misogyny goes on witch hunts, in a slogan. Misogyny is kind of the action, the enforcement wing of a patriarchal order. It pursues women who don't toe the line, whereas sexism is the bad science of patriarchy that says that men and women are very different, should be playing very different roles, often without good evidence of that, especially when we currently have no control group of people raised in a non-patriarchal environment to check that supposed biological sex differences really are intrinsic or innate or natural. We just don't have the evidence of that, and we have no real way of knowing that while these huge social differences between men and women persist, the kinds of social differences that I'm about to give you a sense of according to my framework. Okay, so here is again just my proposed definition of misogyny to show you that that is going to give misogyny certain characteristic properties that are opposed to the naive definition of misogyny. So on my account, misogyny is a structural phenomenon rather than an individualistic one. It's a political phenomenon as opposed to a psychological one. In a slogan, it's about what women face, not what men feel. So I'm much more focused in my work on the kind of environment that girls and women are exposed to, rather than the feelings, thoughts of individual men. And that's partly because misogyny can be perpetrated also by social institutions and policies, such as the ones that I'm going to canvass in a moment, to do with the anti-abortion movement. That is also, I think, major interest to Ruth in her book, because it turns out strong men's proclivity to control bodies is it's a very common feature of strong men, which was, to me, fascinating. So I had this definition that I proposed in my 2017 book, Down Girl, but it immediately raises the question, well, what are the patriarchal norms and expectations that misogyny serves to police and enforce, especially in superficially egalitarian milieu like the US today, my home country of Australia, places where I'm a cultural insider, there's often a sense that we're living in a feminist or post-feminist era. I would really dispute that, but there's nevertheless, I think, a good question about what the patriarchal norms and expectations are and whether they have any unity. I think they do, and my basic answer to this question is contained in my second book, entitled, where I argue that these patriarchal norms and expectations are primarily a matter of a false sense that at least privileged men, and to some extent boys, are entitled to certain goods from similarly or less privileged women. And these take the form of things like sex, most obviously, but still more insidiously, things like love, care, admiration, consent, importantly, control, bodily control, support, deference, as well as power and claims to knowledge, that I'll get into a little later. And by the same token, women are often not deemed entitled to these goods, even when they genuinely are entitled to them. So that can lead to really pernicious and harmful inequities, which particularly affect the most vulnerable women, such as women of color and most especially Black women and Native women in the US context. Which I should say, I'm primarily writing about the US as a kind of cultural analyst of sorts, and I like to be positioned as a kind of cultural insider when I write about these subject matter, while hoping that they have broader applicability to other times, places, contexts. Okay, so 3 examples of this male entitlement that I am concerned about. The first is the entitlement to sex. And in the book, I canvass various manifestations of this entitlement, but perhaps the most obvious are incels. And incels are, for those of you who don't know, this is a term for so-called involuntary celibates. These are young, invariably heterosexual, cis men who embody a sense of entitlement, yes, to sex, but even more so, I think, care, love, affection, and admiration, sexual admiration. So in a way, sex is a currency to buy status for them in an intramasculine hierarchy where they feel like they are not sufficiently recognized as the true alpha male that they either are or wish to be. So the picture I have here on the slide is the face of Elliot Rodger, who in some ways was the figure who really got me interested in this whole project to begin with, because not only did he commit horrible crimes that I'll summarize in a second, but he also, there was a widespread media denial that he was a misogynist or that this was misogyny in action, which made me as a philosopher think that we needed a better definition of misogyny that allowed us to recognize the misogyny of someone like Elliot Rodger, despite the fact that he targeted a particular group of women. Namely, he targeted the, quote, hot blonde sluts who he perceived as denying him the sex and sexual admiration he was owed by them. He said, and I'll just read from the slide here, "You girls have never been attracted to me. I don't know why you girls aren't attracted to me, but I will punish you all for it. It's an injustice, a crime. I don't know what you don't see in me. I'm the perfect guy." So we see here his moralism about the women who he perceived as not giving him his due, and his sense that he was owed something, entitled to something from them, even though he actually didn't introduce himself to any of his targets. He just stalked them from a distance. And he eventually, after uploading a YouTube video called Day of Retribution, he drove to the Alpha Phi sorority house at the University of California, Santa Barbara, banged on the door, was denied entry, and then shot 3 young women walking outside around the corner. He had intended to eviscerate an entire house of women students at UCSB. In the end, he shot 3 and murdered 2 of them, as well as other more random crimes that he committed that day, like stabbing to death his 3 roommates, and going on a subsequent, again, kind of random drive-by shooting spree. So his crimes were fairly obviously motivated, given his series of YouTube videos with these sentiments and a so-called manifesto, really more of a memoir, that betrayed a sense of, betrayal by the girls who had not turned up on his lap, or at least his doorstep, to give him things like love, sex, affection, and admiration. He said, "Girls, all I ever wanted was to love you and to be loved by you. I've wanted a girlfriend, I've wanted sex, I've wanted love, affection, adoration. You think I'm unworthy of it. That's a crime that can never be forgiven." And something that I think may have been somewhat behind the reluctance to acknowledge Elliot Rodger as misogynistic, acting in a misogynistic way, is the sense that he was vulnerable, that he was sad, lonely, disappointed, even though he was also aggrieved, resentful, and full of fury towards the women he perceived as owing him certain favors. So one thing that I would love to ask Ruth about is a distinction I draw between domineering misogynists like Donald Trump and disappointed misogynists like Elliot Rodger. I think we're seeing the transition of Trump from a domineering to a disappointed misogynist as well as white supremacist, and that strikes me as a particularly dangerous transition, both for political leaders and ordinary civilians who find themselves not just lonely, which of course anyone can feel, but with a sense of resentment and grievance because of this sense of entitlement that they embody. I just wanted to briefly flag that, of course, it's not just incels we're concerned about. In the book, I talk about, just as importantly, practices, institutions, and mores endemic to rape culture that the entitlement to sex comprises. So it's also about police departments which fail to prosecute sexual abuse and assault, fail to take evidence from rape kits and leave them to languish, and routinely let even rapists who confess to their crimes, who just let them go, as I show in one of the book's chapters. That's not to say that carceral solutions are the answer. It's to say that this is a symptom within a deeply carceral society of a tendency to excuse sexual crimes in a way that's anomalous as compared to other crimes, regardless of what you think about the best way to tackle crimes in general, which is kind of a question beyond my pay grade. Okay, so one more example, and I'll go through these quite quickly, the entitlement to bodily control. So I think this is something which is embodied by the anti-abortion movement in the US, among other places, which of course advertises itself as pro-life, but I think really is unified by and explained by a sense of entitlement to control the bodies of girls and women. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that anti-abortion activists generally don't care about all other kinds of life that I can mention here, maternal mortality, particularly for Black and Native women in the US. They don't seem to care about Black lives and the police brutality and unjust shootings faced by Black people within our society. They don't seem to care about affordable healthcare, deaths caused by unsafe abortions, for another obvious example, given that in a society which allows abortions, you don't tend to see rates of abortions go up, you just tend to see them safely performed. They don't tend to care about capital punishment, in fact, often endorse it. Things like water quality in many, many places throughout the country, most notoriously Flint, Michigan. For that matter, they don't care about animal cruelty and the literally billions of animals that are slaughtered each year in the US by incredibly cruel methods in factory farming. And finally, they didn't care much about stopping the pandemic. So I argue that Republicans' anti-abortion efforts are best explained by a desire to and sense of entitlement to control the bodies of girls and women rather than some deep investment in life as such. I also link this entitlement to bodily control to the anti-trans movement in the US, again, among other places, trying to control where people are able to do something as simple as use a restroom according to their gender identity, the gender they truly are. There's an extraordinary cruelty in that, as well as a sense of entitlement to control the bodies of trans women, as well as, of course, trans men and non-binary people. Final example, and then I'll stop. So the entitlement to power. So this is kind of the part of the book that interacts, I think, most directly with Ruth's. Here, we see that there is a sense that men are entitled to hold the most powerful positions in society, such as most obviously the presidency, and that there's a corresponding difficulty in gaining power for female counterparts. So here I draw on empirical evidence that women are routinely dismissed as either incompetent on the one hand or unlikable on the other, or more recently unelectable, which is a manifestly self-fulfilling prophecy, with one exception. So the exception is if a woman is perceived as highly, highly communal, as well as highly competent, then she can sometimes overcome the unwillingness to support her or vote for her or what have you. So I trace these inequities to the pernicious sense that it's privileged men rather than women who are entitled to hold power unless, and this is, I think, pertinent to the current moment, a female leader's power is directly deployed under or in service of other people, and she demonstrates great communalities, kindness, compassion, caring, or at least an adherence to patriarchal so-called family values. It's just a quick summary of the goals of my book. So I wanted to expose entitlement, especially white male entitlement in many, though of course not all of its forms, and to argue that girls and women, as well as non-binary people, are often deprived nowadays of what they're genuinely entitled to, so that hopefully they can claim it more easily without punishment of a misogynistic nature. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kate. And there are hundreds of people cheering at home next to their screens right now. But there's so much to engage there. But you obviously really left it perfectly for Ruth, because you left off right where your two projects come together. And so, Ruth, why don't you just pick it up and run?
Sure. So just as Kate wanted to really unpack the concept of misogyny and differentiate it from sexism, I felt it was time to look back over 100 years at authoritarianism. And just to set the record straight, I am not a scholar of comparative literature, but I'm a historian, which is important for this book, and a professor of Italian studies. So my source base was data sets as well as interviews. I interviewed people, some of them are anonymous, who had lived through these regimes I talk about, as well as memoirs and histories and visual propaganda. So I think it's time to look back and contextualize authoritarianism. And we can start with a very contemporary question that I often get asked: is Trump a fascist? And I personally don't call him a fascist, because although he uses many instruments and techniques that came out of fascism and still are part of fascist, neo-fascism today, he's something larger. He's an authoritarian. And so what I did in the book is it's structured around three historical eras. There's the era of fascism with Hitler and Mussolini. There's the Cold War era of military coups. And I focus on Gaddafi and Augusto Pinochet in Chile. And then I have the era of what I call new authoritarians. And these are people who come into office via elections, and then they manipulate elections to keep themselves in power. So I have Putin, I have Erdogan, and other people come in and out like Bolsonaro, and also Trump. And so one of the contributions of the book is to look, and I'm not a historian of America, and I think this is very important, to take this global look take a look at Trump that's informed by global history and informed by the history of authoritarianism, and see to what extent he conforms to this kind of authoritarian playbook. So that's the structure of the book, but it's an exploration of these tools of rule. One of the most fascinating things is that each of these tools gives life to a chapter, and each chapter goes over 100 years. So I have the myth of national greatness. This is like in our country, the MAGA, Make America Great, and why it's actually Make America Great Again. That's very important. You have the utopia and you have the nostalgia. So Erdogan has the Ottoman Empire, Mussolini had the Roman Empire, and Trump it has this kind of mythical America where women knew their place, people of color knew their place, etc. So you have myth of national greatness, you have propaganda, you have virility. I'll come back to that. You have corruption. I added a chapter of corruption because you absolutely cannot understand these men without talking about corruption, and violence. And it was how all of them interact, these tools of rule. And one of the things that was not really surprising to me, but came out very strongly, is that although the circumstances change, although the outcomes vastly change, we don't have as many one-party dictatorships anymore. Genocide is perhaps less common. Mass detention is more common. The actual tools they use and their temperament as leaders is strikingly the same. So the book is about patterns and recurrences, but also giving us a chance through these chapters that go over 100 years to see, Mussolini had his personality cult nourished by newsreels, whereas Trump uses Twitter and Bolsonaro uses Twitter. But what's in common is they have a direct channel to the nation. And one of the paradoxes is that the more, just speaking of propaganda for a minute, the more skilled they are at this kind of mediatized reality, the more authentic they seem to people. So you have Modi, who appears via hologram, so he can be together with his people at rallies. So that's part of the lay of the land. And then I have chapter on resistance, how people have techniques of resistance and what has changed and what has stayed the same. And then the all-important chapter endings. How do you get rid of them? How do they fall from power? Which is of great interest to us today. And in the book, we have only Pinochet, and there's a lot to apply, as different as it may sound. From Pinochet was voted out of office, one of the rare dictators to leave, and tried to do as much damage as possible before he left, out of spite and out of vindictiveness. So to hone in on virility, because that's what we're talking about, masculinity, just to show you how these tools interact. So the personality cult, which is just key to all of these figures, and Trump's one of his greatest successes was the construction of a personality cult. And the canons of the personality cult don't change, which is really interesting. So you have to be a man of the people. You have to be, many of them have the crude sense of humor, like Putin. They're able to use very kind of populist language. They're very direct. They say things that shock people and surprise people. So they're very relatable. But very important, they're also a man above all other men. And they have this kind of sometimes special qualities, right? And charisma endows them with a special or magical quality. So you have that. And they rule by divine benediction. And so it's been very interesting. Some of the most profane rulers, like, the atheist Mussolini, who was the one to make the deal with the Vatican, he was thought to be ruling with divine benediction. And of course, Trump, the sexual assaulter, money launderer, all of the crimes, is embraced by evangelical Christians, as is Bolsonaro, and by Orthodox Jews as somebody who rules with divine benediction. So these men are men of the people, but they're also the only men who can see where the nation's going and see its potential. So both Mobutu and Gaddafi had the title of guide, right? Because they had this kind of foreseeing capacity. So this man above all other men is very important. So that's how it factors into the kind of national greatness and propaganda. Then you have corruption, which is absolutely key. And in the book, it's not just financial corruption I talk about, but moral corruption. How do these people get people to how do they domesticate the men and the women who work with them? How do they buy people off? And it's too easy to think only in terms of intimidation and blackmail, because the sad truth is that the strongman is a man who gets away with it. And this interacts very much with Kate's book. He gets away with what ordinary men cannot get away with, and the things he does are outrageous, and yet he pays no penalty. Indeed, he's rewarded for it. Whether it's sleeping with the wives, the wives of his officials, which is what Gaddafi did, and Saddam Hussein and Mobutu, or being spanked by porn stars and saying, awful things, and people then show up in T-shirts saying, and women, boy, I'd like him to grab my you-know-what. So they're kind of Teflon rulers, and we have Berlusconi in this vein too. So they get away with it. So I have a phrase in there that an ethos of macho lawlessness is at the very center of authoritarian rule, and also informs leaders like Berlusconi and Trump, who never wrecked democracy, but bent it to their needs. And machismo and being a sexual conqueror was very, very important to both of these men. So these are the kind of instruments, and violence, of course, the ability to dominate bodies. And so one of the key concepts that evolved as I wrote was that in a way they're kind of hoarders, these strong men. They have a mania to possess bodies, possess territory. Not all of them are expansionist, but riches. So they end up with these bunkers, right? And I kind of indict the architecture of offshore Swiss bank accounts and offshore finance that allows them to store all their loot while they're anti-globalist today, but they have this global banks helping them store their loot. But as far as their own people, they have a mania of possession. They need to have our attention 24/7. And again, Trump has been very successful in making the media talk all about him. What's he going to do today? What tweet is he going to send now? Who is he going to threaten today? And he has done this without the conditions of historic authoritarianism. He doesn't have total state control of the media. So this possession of our minds and our bodies for labor, for war, for demographic purposes is really important. And it's that's where the virility, that they are able to possess things and people that other men cannot. So this is really at the center. And John Lee Anderson, the New Yorker writer, I learned a lot from him because he went to interview Pinochet, went to interview Gaddafi, and he this is in the 80s and 90s, and he really understood this psychological, he doesn't use the word hoarding, but I am, this mania for possession very well. So my account of authoritarianism has an awful lot about bodies in it. And it extends to my discussion of resistance, because at one point, Kate used the word, when talking about gaslighting, which we'll talk about, someone who's been gaslit is someone who's been colonized. And I really do see authoritarianism as a kind of colonization of the self and society. So, and public space, of course, with rallies, with the statues, with their version of history as it's concretized in the landscape. So it's been very interesting to study the history of resistance, both interventions that resistors have made to reclaim public space. And one of the most obvious is with mass protest. So there's a lot in the book about that. But I also have things about public art, whether it was the very brave art collective, CADA, they go by their initials, in Pinochet's Chile in the early 80s, who started putting these kind of signs up, no, and then a plus, no más. Or somebody who's working today, who I interviewed for the book and I collaborate with sometimes, Robin Bell, who is a projection artist. He's known for his projections on the facade of the Trump, excuse me, the Trump International Hotel. So if you recall when Trump said that African countries were shitholes, he did a projection that said, this is a shithole. So speaking back and reclaiming public space. But there's also histories of, within in-person resistance, and today a lot of resistance can be digital, but the core of resistance is bodies coming together in a public space to reclaim that space and create something out of that synergy. There are also people who refute the control of the body by killing themselves. There's a history of self-immolation that runs around the world. Or people, and there's people in Putin's Russia who do this, sewing your mouth shut to protest censorship, to protest propaganda. So the history of authoritarianism is written on the body, it's written through bodies, and it's refuted through the body. So that was a very moving part of doing the research, to also see how sometimes resistance techniques get appropriated in other times and places. So when the fall of communism happened, there was it was called the Baltic chain. It was a human chain across the Baltics of people holding hands. And in 2019, the Hong Kong resistors appropriated that, these human chains, right? So you have these techniques that recur. And so when we get to the end, when the strongman either is going to be defeated because of war, or he, in rare cases, is voted out, or he is forced to go into exile, or he's hunted by his own people, I talk about how the systems that kept him in power, from violence and intimidation to constructing cocoons around himself with flatterers and family members who are too afraid to tell him the truth, all of this becomes counterproductive. So Mussolini was the first, but not the last, who said, I trust my instincts and I'm never wrong, right? And then he was famously very wrong and ended up killed by partisans, and before that removed by his own people. Or Trump says, somebody asked him about who he consults with in foreign policy, and he said, I don't consult with anyone because I have a big, beautiful brain. So this solipsism of the strongman who as we see, is very weak and very brittle and very insecure and cannot stand others removing his sense of reality the way he thinks it is. So to come back to the present, where Eric started talking about where we are now, this history of the past, and unfortunately for us, and we can say this with a little less anxiety because of the election, Trump maps on 100% to the character and temperament and aspirations of all the leaders I studied. His way of doing government, of treating other people, of thinking about himself, of thinking about the world is the same. So history can allow you to think about what's going on in the present, of course. And so it's completely predictable that Trump is not going to, he's psychologically unable to admit defeat, And as Kate said, this is the passage from dominant to disappointed is a highly dangerous time. And so today we heard that he fired the defense secretary. There's going to be a lot of acting out behavior to save face and to feel dominant. So I'll stop there on that on that note. That is very, a point of connection to our books. But say one thing where when I read Kate's book for this event, many of the things that she describes, the policing, the strategies of domination that happen in democracies because of social habit and other enforced by laws, often in the case of anti-abortion. But my book looks at what happens when these things become state policy. And so when machismo is not just an attitude, but it becomes policed and acted out in torture rooms and in prisons and in all of the spaces that authoritarian states find to dominate people. And one of the saddest things is that many men collaborate with authoritarian states and repress, women because it makes them feel superior. But sooner or later, the authoritarian comes from them too, because the secret that some theorists figured out in the 1920s and 30s on the basis of Mussolini is that the authoritarian despises and scorns his people. And so it's very poignant that they put their trust in him, that they love him. And that's something that recurs.
Great. Thank you, Ruth. I mean, I think it's just abundantly clear that this is an urgent book for the moment, and that there's so much here that we're not going to be able to get to in the next 20 minutes. So I know we're going to be reading a lot from you and hearing more from you in the next several weeks and months as these things play out in real time. To the audience, I just want to tell you there's two ways you can ask a question that I'll get through the chat. One is that you can write your question on Twitter at NYU_IPK, or you can also leave a question or comment in the live chat on the YouTube. And we've gotten a bunch of questions already. The first I want to ask you is really a question for both of you. Ruth, you said something about these strong men, which I think is really interesting and engages with Kate's work in an interesting way. It's that these are men, you said, who are able to pull off things that other men cannot, kind of living out a fantasy of male domination at an extreme level. And what's interesting to me is in Kate's book, we learn about the kind of quotidian ways in which men are attempting to pull these things off as well, not at the scale of the nation state maybe, but at the scale of, their social circle or university campus. And I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about this relationship between pulling off things that other men cannot, being acceptable and admired, having charisma because, you can get away with it, and how that relates to the kind of everyday gendered violence that Kate writes about.
So in the virility chapter, I talk about the sex life of the strong man, and that the principle of them having to have pipelines of bodies, and they organize their states in ways that they can use the secret police, they can use party functionaries and civil servants to scout for women, to bring them in. From Mussolini, if someone wrote him a letter and attached a photograph, they would be scouted and brought in and then given an audience. And we don't know if it was consensual or raped, but he went through thousands and thousands of women. I've estimated he slept with about 25,000 women. So these are large scale machines of libidinal gratification that I'm writing about. And they happen also outside of dictatorship. So when Kate talks about Jeffrey Epstein and this kind of, these large-scale operations of using women and exploiting women. And there's even an intersection there because she mentions Ambra Gutierrez, who was one of the victims of Harvey Weinstein. Well, Ambra was in America because she had been in Italy and she got roped into Berlusconi's sex parties. And Berlusconi used the mechanisms of the state and his private TV networks to find women and groom them and keep them and have them available. So one of the things we learn from this is that the same mechanisms of procurement and domination and abuses of power, they transfer from the private to the public sphere very, very easily. And these are part of and often these things are kind of known and they become part of the head of state's macho appeal. So there's a normalization of crime toward women and it becomes part of his personality cult. And this isn't only Mussolini or Gaddafi, but it's also up to Berlusconi and up to Trump.
Yeah, no, I think that is very illuminating. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, I see a continuum between ordinary entitled male behavior and the more extreme and truly eyebrow-raising behavior of the strongman. I mean, one way to look at this is that there is a permission structure for at least racially privileged men, which not all men will take advantage of, to be fair. Many men will be restrained by principle, by conscience, and also by other social factors that constrain them in various ways. And I think one way to look at it is the strongman, it seemed to me by looking at Ruth's book, is maximally unconstrained. He makes the law, he's not bound by the law. And moreover, law and order to him is patriarchal law and order, not the law of the land, oftentimes. But he's maximally unconstrained either by social factors or by conscience or principle or any kind of moral scruple, because he's someone who is just highly narcissistic, has a pathological or in some cases no real relationship with morality. I mean, Trump is interestingly devoid of any kind of moral compass. And so there's no real restraint. We can look at these cases as showing what male entitlement is in its most extreme form, because these are men who can get away with it.
So I'm going to ask a question that comes, partly from me and partly from some of the things coming in on the chat. Some people have noted, we've just, not just gone through an election, but also a couple of years in which the Me Too movement really emerged as a major political and cultural force. And then in this election, the man who won, was named and belittled for being not especially manly during the election. His stuttering was used against him as a sign of a kind of lack of virility and power. He was mocked during the campaign. He was trying to be safe during the pandemic, and he was mocked as hiding in his basement. And I think there was even some more specific kind of sexist rhetoric that was used to describe his behavior. And I wonder if you have thoughts about these countervailing trends and how they shape this experience we're in right now. It's not just a story of kind of conventional authoritarian masculine domination. There seems like something else is going on, people are noting.
Yeah, and there was also, I can't help noting that choice comment of conservative commentator Tommy Lauren, who said, may as well wear a purse with that mask, Joe, on right. Twitter. Of course, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it captured a grain of truth in conservative thought, or a grain of untruth, rather, which is that trying to protect others and admitting that both you may be subject to harm and that you may harm others, that's perceived as weakness. Admitting certain kinds of vulnerability as well as capacities to cause harm is seen as weakness. So I think something I've been very interested in, and I think I originally underestimated, because I've been very focused on what happens when men go head to head with women in male-dominated societies, especially for the ultimate masculine-coded authority positions like the presidency. And I think the empirical evidence suggests there are strong biases in men's favor under those circumstances, which we need to work very hard to combat. I think around 85% of people in the studies that I've looked at, and these are studies of fairly young people, millennials, roughly my age, as an elderly millennial myself, these are people who 85% of the time, regardless of their own gender, will favor a man over a woman. But that doesn't mean there aren't gender dynamics in play when it's a man going head to head with a man, when one is perceived as a strong man and the other is perceived as lacking in certain, to use Ruth's language, virile qualities. And I think we saw that there is a tendency to downrank men who have more feminine coded attributes, particularly Biden ran on being someone who would be caring and compassionate and concerned with the health of American citizens. And that's something which, I think to me and to my interlocutors and to many in the audience, that will sound like a kind of no-brainer, politically speaking, for what a leader ought to do. And yet it turns out to be actually highly controversial, I think partly because of gender dynamics, which say that caring is women's work and men who pursue it are, if I may, pussies.
Yeah. There's also this kind of fascinating feature of his relationship, with the vice president, who is perceived by many to be the kind of more aggressive one, right? And being the more powerful of the two.
And she once challenged him in a debate on his history of working with segregationists. And so that makes
quite
her
successfully.
Yes, very, very much so. And that makes her a tricky figure. It makes her not a woman who's perceived as subordinate in the way that both a VP in general and a female VP in particular is required to be.
And one of the things that's we look at in transitions, whether they're to an authoritarian development or out of one, is so on the first front, one of the biggest patterns that I found is that these men have an appeal when there have been times of great social progress, either racial emancipation or gender progress or same-sex marriage in recent times. If that's approved, now Putin's trying to take it away. Orban's transphobia, all of these things are attempts to bring order to a world that was becoming disordered. Mm-hmm. So these men have appeal around the world at moments when there's secularization, there's emancipation, and thus there's a need for heroes. And the obvious example of after World War I with all the male mutilation and dismemberment. But so that's the kind of foundational case and created fascism, this need for heroes. And this is a big theme of neo-fascist culture, neo-Nazi culture, this heroic male who mistreats women, and women are, at home with the braids on and threshing wheat or whatever the heck they're supposed to be doing. This imagery of the hard-bodied man, and so all these like binaries. But when you come out of these experiences, it's all very interesting because a poll of Chilean college-age students in the 1980s, after more than a decade of dictatorship, they overwhelmingly wanted a civilian leader. They were tired of this blustery, violent, militarized masculinity. And the person who was successful at becoming the next head of state after Pinochet was a law professor who wore baggy cardigans. He was very approachable. He was a moderate. He was a Christian Democrat, Patricio Aylwin. but he looked very non-threatening. And this kind of non-threatening civilian masculinity was what the culture needed. It needed normality. So we can, there's very different, I'm not trying to draw an analogy between coming out of 17 years of a dictatorship that tortured people and what we've had. But this need for decency and normality requires a different kind of masculinity. And, and yet the followers of Trump and this, like, you know, this kind of Trumpified masculinity, that has aggressive masculinity, they don't want to let this go easily. And that's why I said at the beginning, this is a very delicate moment for Trump followers, because it's a whole culture of masculine privilege that they are losing with the departure of their leader from the White House. And he, in not conceding, he is holding out that fantasy for them. And indeed, what did he say yesterday or today? That he's going to keep doing rallies. He has to keep everybody suspended in this glass container of fantasy. And as reality starts to sink in, there's going to be a lot of aberrant and perhaps violent behavior.
Totally predictable, but still very jarring to see the lines at the gun shops around the country this weekend, and to see the threats intensify. And, you know, I made this comment in the very beginning that I think it's a little bit part of the gaslighting phenomenon. I think it's hard for some people to know, you know, what's really going on here. Is this a performance that's kind of made for television? There's a bunch of things that if you saw in another state, you would say this is an authoritarian leader who's trying to stage a coup. And the question is that what's happening here? Or is this someone who happens to be doing all the things that one would do to stage a coup? And it speaks to the issue of you know, the strength of our institutions, which, you know, some people continue to believe will ultimately kind of work out the way they're supposed to. And it also speaks, I think, to some extent to you know, the kind of where, you know, where we get with the media, how Trump's performance as an authoritarian gets aired or not in coming days.
Yeah.
We have another question, a little bit more sociological too, which kind of picks up on something, Ruth, that you mentioned as you kind of looked at across different societies that have gone in the authoritarian direction, gone for strong men. And that's whether you can see something that kind of is structurally there, some underlying set of conditions that make a society especially prone to kind of strongman rule. You know, you said something about the flip side. You know, after it, you long for a healer. And you said something about things that make you long for a strong man in terms of the kind of the loss to a nation. But I wonder if you could formalize that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely, every single society that I looked at had just come off of a period of great upheaval in some ways, either upheaval, like obviously post World War I, also decolonization, which birthed a whole other school of strongmen and leaders who behaved very similarly, some of them to authoritarians. And then you have the fall of the Cold War, which displaced and allowed the rise of a new right and came. So sometimes it's political uncertainty, sometimes it's processes of emancipation that many feel need to be tamed. And it's at that moment that certain men who are very savvy with the media and know how to get their backers, their alliances fixed with conservative elites, because without conservative elites, unless you're doing a coup, and even then, in most cases, you still need them. So there has to be a widespread opinion that there is enough unrest that only this heroic individual can tame them. And that happens every time. Even in Chile, you had Allende, who's a socialist president, enormously popular, who was doing various kinds of emancipation in society, including gender, but was also anti-imperial. So he was jeopardizing capitalism in certain ways. So they are a kind of reaction formation. But the trick is that many of them also pose, as Mussolini set the tone here, as revolutionaries. And they attract young men who want to bust heads and throw up all of these categories and hierarchies. But the true definition is, Mussolini said that fascism was a revolution of reaction, and that you could use the emancipatory rhetoric of revolution, because he had been a socialist, to actually police and shut down emancipatory tendencies that you don't like. And so when they throw everything up, everything is up for grabs. When a strongman comes on the scene, it's like an earthquake. And look what Trump has done. He's domesticated the GOP, but he's caused all kinds of, there's the never Trumpers. He's caused an earthquake in American society. And gender is an interesting lens, because the underlying gender hierarchies and things often continue right on. And in fact, there can be anxiety when strongmen are leaving, because people fear there might be too much emancipation all of a sudden. So that's a different, there's no time to talk about all of that. But gender is a very good category through which to examine anxieties about transitions.
Yeah, and just very quickly, I think the dynamic that Ruth has crystallized there are really reflected in the general dynamics of misogyny. We make a huge mistake to think that progress is linear or monolithic. Progress goes hand in hand with backlash. So it's often precisely the times that we see real feminist social progress or real anti-racist progress that then we see enormously destructive, misogynistic, as well as racist social movements arising. And I think that's something we need to get better at conceptualizing, that, there is just a kind of, as Tracy McMillan Cotton called it, a do-si-do dance of progress and backlash. It's not up and down or back and forward. It's they go hand in hand. They're part of the same dynamic.
So listen, I know that we promised that we would end at 6, but it seems unjust to stop it just quite yet, because there's so many questions that people have. Do you mind if I ask 2 questions, different categories, and you can each kind of handle them however you like before we go?
Sounds great.
Fine.
So the first kind of category of question that's out there, Kate, I think is especially here for you. Ruth, you might want to weigh in also. And essentially, some people are wondering if you could say a little bit more about the reasons that some women, and you could even say so many women, seem to openly support misogyny as a structural feature of the world that we live in. And Ruth, if you want to take it, I guess the question is why so many women support a kind of authoritarian masculinity, which is so clearly organized in support of misogyny.
Yeah, thanks. I think the crucial thing to see is that patriarchy incentivizes women to kowtow to patriarchal norms and expectations, and in particular, to play nice with respect to powerful and privileged men. One of the really striking things about gender oppression, which is a little different from some other forms of oppression, although they of course intersect, is that gender oppression involves subordination with a smile. It involves not just submitting to a dominant man, but to doing so in a way that appears to be seamless, loving, giving, and entirely voluntary. And so because of that, internalized misogyny, internalized patriarchy often involves women using their own agency to to defer to and subordinate themselves to patriarchal figures. And I thought Ruth's book brought out powerfully that that's just as true, if not more so, in the political realm.
Yeah, this is an example where our books talk together very, very well. Yeah, so the support that women give to authoritarian, misogynistic states is different levels. One is structural, where, as Kate said, so there's, you know, many of these rulers actually mobilized women in unheard of numbers, both Hitler, Mussolini, and social welfare, and also persecution of bureaucracies. Many women had, you know, careers that took them away from families and homes to serve the regime. Of course, there are the female enablers who are helping the regime to dominate other women. But I think Kate has a phrase in her book that's almost identical to a phrase I have in my book. And hers is, a man may be happy to extend a certain amount of power to a woman as long as she does not threaten or challenge him. And I have this when I talk about Berlusconi and Putin, who promote women. And look at Trump. He had, you know, he had Betsy DeVos and some other female cabinet secretaries, even though he's very quick to humiliate women, and we all know where that goes. So the key is that he is the alpha male on the top, and he can only tolerate them when you know, they're still working for him. And I give the example of Angela Merkel, who has the rare privilege of having been mistreated by you know, Putin, who made her wait 4 hours and unleashed a dog on her during their meetings because he knows that she has a fear of dogs. You know, Trump refused to shake her hand. Berlusconi called her, you know, various obscenities. Because she's the same head of state as they are, that they can't stand. On the other level, women who are devoted to the leader, it's very interesting because the masculinity of the strongman is actually quite complex, because we've talked more about the brutalist domineering the alpha male. But because they have this cult of victimhood, all of them, from Erdogan, Mussolini, they all have this cult of, they embody the nation, so they are victims. They're taking the hits for the nation. They all talk about plots and witch hunts against them. So actually, there's a lot of protectiveness that is engendered in women who would do anything for them. And many of them make themselves vulnerable. They show emotions. So Trump doesn't just salute the flag. I have a picture in my book of him hugging the flag. And at his rallies, you know, I have quotes from women who say, well, he's so emotional, he's so passionate. We don't usually see that in a politician. Or Bolsonaro is a really interesting example. So he's Mr. He-Man, Mr., you know, let's go back to the military dictatorship. But when he had an assassination attempt on him and he was wounded, he's done this 2 times. He videoed a video message from his hospital bed, hooked up to monitors. So a lot of them have this kind of vulnerability that they exploit if it helps them. And they seem to be very transparent and authentic. They're suffering on behalf of the nation. And this is very effective, particularly with women. And this is one, so it's not all about domination, it's about them getting people to feel protective of them.
Okay, last question. Because we're living through a very intense moment right now. And it does feel like everything is on the line. And it feels potentially that there's something like structural transformation in the air. I mean, there's not quite clear where we're heading, but a lot seems possible. Some people are wondering if either of you have thoughts about how you undo strongmen. And, you know, how do you take it apart? And you could answer this question at any scale, kind of in our social structures and everyday life, or in the political realm, where, you know, someone is refusing to leave office or recognize the legitimacy of a vote. Kate, why don't we start with you and then give Ruth the last word?
Sounds good. I mean, my main thought is that we need to socialize boys to be better men. I'm not sure how you undo an existing strong man or an existing misogynist. I wish I did. But I do think one of the most powerful things we can do is raise boys to think that care work is not beneath them and that it's actually meaningful and important, and it will always need doing. To me, the antidote to leaders like Trump is someone like the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who embodies a sense of compassion for her people, a sense of feminine coded responsibilities for caring for people's health, their well-being, education, the environment. And I think we need, for many reasons, including for men themselves, to raise men capable of being leaders more like that, and human beings more like that. We need it partly because there's, famously and notoriously a dearth of meaning and meaningful work that men now have available. And we find in areas with high unemployment, men refusing to take care work on, even when it would be quite well paid and meaningful. And so as a structural solution, having men do more care work, both in the home, where they notoriously, again, don't do their bit, as political leaders, where they notoriously tend to be masculine authoritarians rather than showing any kind of ethic of care, and in the workplace, where they themselves would be able to do something important and meaningful, and something that can be quite well compensated in care work that can never be done offshore, can never be exported. I think there are so many reasons why we need to focus on raising men to be more caring.
Okay, that's a long-term plan. Thank you. We need to keep this in perspective. Ruth, we're also living through a political emergency. I wonder if you have any ideas about the present.
Well, I conclude in the book that until we get rid of our cult of male power that undergirds a notion of leadership in this country, we're not going to get very far. And if we think about even, I was looking in vain when I was doing the research on charisma. And there's lots of women are reputed to have charisma as actresses or actors or in media and spectacle. But political charisma is still anchored to these notions that were formulated by Max Weber, who died in 1920. And I was like, are there any feminist critiques of political charisma? Because the kind of charisma that sadly, like 100 years later, is still around is that personified by the fascists, where it's not just that they are attract people to them, which is all kinds of charisma. That could be actors, that could be public figures, but they get you to do their bidding. This was the innovation of fascism that in the New York Times, one of the first time it mentioned Hitler in 1922, it said, crowds fall under his spell. This was charisma. And so sadly, it's like we're in 2020 and we're still dealing with the fetish of this brand of male glamour, political glamour. The man who comes in and takes care of everything. The man who, again, is glamorous. And so we need to think about character and leadership, but also what kind of leaders we keep revering. And I guess to go out for the final comment is that one of the missions I had in writing this book was to correct this idea that's perpetrated by PR firms, that American PR firms that authoritarians hire, and their own state's propaganda, that authoritarian states are, efficient and productive, and these very male-coded, they're muscular, right? They get things done. And this is all gender coded. And in fact, they're highly destructive and chaotic environments, all of them. And you've seen we've had a little taste in America of what the leadership habits and other dysfunctions that come from having an authoritarian temperamental person in office. And we are in a very precarious moment, but we have been able to, with this election, we have reversed a course that I am quite convinced would have led to authoritarian consolidation. So we can feel good about that, because that's very rare achievement in history. However, we still need to work on the way we conceive of power, of political power. Otherwise, the Trumps and the Berlusconis, the Putins will continue on.
Well, listen, I know that if we were all in person, you would really feel how much we appreciate these terrific ideas and your really careful research and scholarship and writing. I'm sorry, it's one of the costs of this arrangement is I can see all of the love on the chat and on Twitter, and you just have a silent room that you're sitting in. But trust me, it's just wonderful, and we at the Institute for Public Knowledge are grateful that each of you took time to share your work with us. A reminder: Kate Mann's latest book is entitled "How Male Privilege Hurts Women," and Ruth Ben-Ghiat's book. Oh, could you lift it up?
Oh, I'm going to show it because it has a cool cover, and it comes out tomorrow.
Yeah.
So, I'm very excited.
Those of you who are regulars at IPK know that what we always say is that our events are free and open to the public, and all we ask is that you don't make the bookseller go home with books in their boxes. We need everyone to get the book. So we're still free, but there's no bookseller here tonight. So find your local bookseller and support them, and support these writers who are doing exactly the kind of work we need to get to a better place. Thank you all.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you soon at